So we're going to jump straight in to part 1, which is applicable to all your CA essays, and it's going to give us the definitions of the fundamental principles that we have to adhere to as CA essays, as well as the definition of the threats that we could face because we are CA essays and we have these fundamental principles we need to adhere to. And then it'll give us just some definitions about safeguards, because that you won't use, you will rather go into the section where that situation is being faced and then discuss the safeguards that they give you. Because for every scenario you're faced with, they will give you specific examples of safeguards to try and address those threats. Okay, so this is just the theory of what the safeguards really are, but it's not really going to help you in a situation. The definitions on the fundamental principles and the threats are going to help you, because you're going to be able to take a scenario and say, which fundamental principle do I think this scenario is going to affect, and which specific threat do I think will affect it, because I can understand the two and apply my understanding to that situation. Okay, so just a quick little summary here of them. Integrity is obviously that you've got to be honest and truthful. Objectivity, you have to remain unbiased. You cannot be influenced. Confidentiality, you've got to keep information confidential, so you cannot disclose information. And I'll say private information, but I mean private to the company that you are employed with or the company that you will be auditing. So that's how both CAs could affect or be affected by confidentiality. Professional behavior, you have to act in a manner that would be considered professional. Okay, and if you can see that your behavior is being influenced in any way, you've got a breach of professional behavior. Professional competence and due care, so you've got to have the relevant knowledge and the qualifications for what you are doing. Okay, so guys, any situation that you are faced with, you should be able to then discuss which of these could be influenced because I understand their definitions. In terms of the threat definitions, self-interest. So here you put in yourself and your interests before either your audit client or your employee or your employment entity. So it's all about you and not anybody else. Self-review, which is most likely to only affect the auditors, is where you have to review work that you have done. And it's likely that if you're reviewing the work you've done, you're going to think it's perfect because you did that work. Familiarity, so you're too close to a situation to see objectively. And familiarity, I'm too familiar with the client, I'm too familiar with my interest that I have in the business in order to see past it. Okay, so it may not just be a personal familiarity, it could be a business familiarity or situational familiarity. Intimidation, I am being pressured. And that pressure is going to make me act in a way I would not act if I didn't feel that pressure. Okay, advocacy is, again, it's a familiarity but within a specific legal scenario. And so because you're now representing either your firm or your employment organization on this matter, you become biased towards them. Okay, so it's the familiarity because of the situation that you're in, but it's got to do with something legal. And guys, just think about it. An advocate would generally be considered in a legal environment, so you can use the definition of that to help you with your understanding there. Okay, so I now want to take you into the CPC, into Part A, to see where those fundamental principles are highlighted so that you can see it, you can refer to it, you can highlight it, and then you know where you can find the information if you need to. And then after that, into where the threats are dealt with once again, so you've got them, you can refer back and you can use that to help you to identify the specific threats in a scenario if it isn't covered in the CPC. Section 110 addresses the fundamental principles in a summarized form. So you can see there, integrity. Summarized is that you need to be straightforward and honest in your professional and business relationships. Objectivity. You need to exercise professional or business judgment and not be compromised by bias, conflict of interest, or undue influence. Professional competence and due care. You need to attain and maintain. So you first need to achieve, and then once you've achieved the professional knowledge, you need to maintain that so that any engagements that you accept, whether it be as auditors or in your other CASA roles, you are competent for that service. Okay, you need to act diligently in accordance with all the professional standards. Confidentiality. You need to respect the confidentiality of information. And professional behavior, you have to comply with the relevant laws and regulations, behave in a manner that is consistent with the profession's responsibility to act in the public interest, and avoid conduct that might discredit the profession. So that's the summary of all of them. Guys, if you go down, then each fundamental principle has a little bit more information on what is expected for that specific fundamental principle. I'm very comfortable with the summary for each of them. There are just a few points that I do also want to highlight in a few. So for integrity, straightforward and honest, something that often comes up is there's a report that has fraudulent financial reporting in it, or you know that the tax returns haven't included certain profits that should be. So in addition, in terms of maintaining integrity, it says you shall not knowingly be associated with reports or returns where there could be materially false or misleading statements provided recklessly, or they omit information that would make them misleading. So if in a scenario you see that you know that the client hasn't submitted tax returns including certain revenue for the past few years, you now need to go and specifically state this in terms of the threat to integrity. Okay. Objectivity, I'm comfortable. Professional competence and due care, I don't think there's anything there I want to highlight in addition. Confidentiality, I do want to highlight something here, because you need to maintain confidential information even after the relationship has ended. So that's something important to note. But then, when are you able to disclose confidential information? Because just because it's confidential doesn't mean you are not allowed to say anything or use it anywhere. There are scenarios where that confidential information needs to come out, but these are the requirements. If they are required by law because of something like a legal proceeding or public authority requirements like IRBA require that this be disclosed, like a reportable irregularity, then you can disclose confidential information. Or if it's permitted by law, so now it's not required, the law does allow it, but it isn't something that has to be, then it must in addition be authorized by the client. So if the client says, hey, you can disclose this information, well then you can. If the client doesn't say you can, but law requires you, well then you have to. And then if you have a professional right to disclose, then you need to comply with the law. So it cannot be prohibited by law. You've got to comply with the quality review of IRBA, respond to any inquiries by IRBA, protect the professional interests of a professional accountant in the legal proceedings, and comply with the technical and professional standards. So there are scenarios where you can disclose confidential information. You just need to make sure the requirements of those scenarios are adhered to. And then finally, your professional behavior. Just to note here that it's what any reasonable, informed third party would consider to be professional behavior. So if you are acting outside of that, then you would potentially be discrediting the profession. Also, marketing is addressed under professional behavior and how you must be truthful and honest and not exaggerate in your marketing claims. Okay, if we go down further, we will get to the threats. Identifying the threats, and there you've got them in 120.6. We've got a self-interest threat is where we've got a financial or other interest that will inappropriately influence our judgment. So we become biased to our interest as opposed to anybody else's interest. Self-review, we are evaluating the results of the work we performed. So we're going to be biased to our work. Advocacy, we promote the client's position or the employing organization, if I'm a CA in business position, to the point that I'm no longer objective. Familiarity, whether it be a close relationship or an interest that I have, that affects me, and I am too sympathetic because I'm too familiar. Intimidation, I can't act objectively because of the perceived pressure that I'm facing. Those are my threats to the fundamental principles which we've just discussed. And now we get to the conceptual framework, how we are supposed to address a scenario that we're going to face as a CASA, whether in business or in public practice. We've looked at the definitions of the threats and the fundamental principles, so the first thing we need to do when we see a situation is to identify the threat to the fundamental principle. Then, once we see that, we need to evaluate the significance of that threat. Is it something that we can work around, or is that very significant that we are not going to be able to adhere to the fundamental principle that is being threatened? This evaluation I am going to find in the specific section where that scenario is dealt with. So what do I mean? I'm going to be faced with a situation that potentially threatens my fundamental principles. That situation is in part 2 or part 3 or part 4A. And all I need to do is then go and say, where is that situation dealt with? Okay, what do they say I need to do to evaluate the significance? Because the CPC is going to give me ways to evaluate. And then I need to apply safeguards, and the CPC again in that scenario is going to give me safeguards that can eliminate that threat, or it's going to tell us you can't eliminate this threat, you need to stop this situation. Okay, so although this is the framework, I need to know I need to apply this. The answers 2, 1, 2, and 3 I will be able to find in a specific situation. If that situation is not covered, I need to then still do this. By definitions, identify what the threat to the fundamental principle is, and then use my own logic to decide if I think it's significant, and my own logic to come up with safeguards, or say it's too significant. Okay, but guys, that case I don't expect, because if this in a question, they're going to be testing something that has been addressed in the CPC. In practice, you might find yourself in a scenario that's not covered in the CPC. Okay, but we will be able to find how to evaluate and to apply the safeguards by looking at the specific section in the CPC. All right, let's go to section 120 where that framework is highlighted. You must go and highlight this and flag this so that you remember this is how I answer a question where there's a threat to a fundamental principle. I'm going to get marks for going through this 3-step approach. And the framework says you need to 1. Identify the threats to the fundamental principles. 2. Evaluate the threats. And then 3. Provide a safeguard so that you eliminate or you reduce that threat to an acceptable level. So now we are going to start with part 2, and we're going to start to just understand the situations that a CA in business can face. And I'm saying to you, as we start to read up about a different situation, I want you to start applying this framework. What is the threat to the fundamental principle? Let me evaluate the significance of that threat, and then let me provide a way to address that threat. Okay, so let's look at part 2.